There is a number. A single, precise number that functions not as a savings goal, not as a financial milestone, and not as a budgeting target. It functions as a systemic exit coordinate, the exact point at which 5 separate banking extraction mechanisms simultaneously fail to operate against you. Your employer loses all mathematical leverage over your labor, and your brain's prefrontal cortex regains full executive function after years of operating under neurobiologically documented impairment. That number is $20,000. And before this analysis concludes, you will understand exactly why that specific figure represents one of the most consequential thresholds in the entire architecture of American personal finance, backed not by opinion, but by peer-reviewed neuroscience, Federal Reserve consumer data, and CFPB regulatory enforcement findings. But we begin with your brain. Because the most important thing you do not know about your financial situation is not about money. It is about cognition. In research published in Science magazine, Princeton economists Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shaffer quantitatively documented that financial scarcity consumes approximately 13 IQ points of cognitive bandwidth. Read these exact words carefully: 13 measurable cognitive function points, assessed using validated Raven's progressive matrices testing, systematically eliminated by the persistent psychological state of financial scarcity. Compare these two cognitive states side by side. On the left side, a brain operating under chronic financial stress, with prefrontal cortex resources continuously allocated toward scarcity management, threat monitoring, and short-horizon crisis calculation. On the right, the identical brain architecture operating with a stable liquid buffer, prefrontal resources fully available for long-range planning, negotiation strategy, and rational comparative decision-making. Look at the massive gap between this side and that side in available executive function capacity. That gap is not a character difference. It is a documented neurobiological measurement. Notice this highlighted term carefully. 13 IQ points represents a cognitive impairment equivalent to losing an entire night of sleep, every single day, on a permanent basis. And this is the scientific permission structure that this entire analysis is built upon. If you have made financial decisions over the past several years that you cannot fully explain, decisions that seemed logical under pressure but produced outcomes you cannot justify in retrospect, you did not make those decisions with full cognitive capacity. You made them with a prefrontal cortex operating under documented resource impairment. The shame dissolves when the mechanism becomes visible. Now follow this curve upward as it grows into the institutional layer. Because the 13 IQ point impairment does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a financial ecosystem that has been specifically and algorithmically engineered to identify that impairment and extract maximum value from it. Inside this specific container, we isolate what FDIC consumer compliance data documents as the fee extraction architecture operating against low-balance consumers. Notice this bounded section right here. The bottom 40% of income earners by liquid savings generate a disproportionate 70% of total bank fee revenue. That is not a passive correlation. That is a mathematically regressive revenue system disguised as standard banking service delivery. The numbers peaked right at this high point in 2022, $7.7 billion in documented overdraft fee extraction in a single calendar year across the American banking system. Follow this trend line and notice this percentage concentration when we overlay low-balance consumer behavioral data against fee revenue distribution. The extraction is not distributed evenly. It is architecturally concentrated against a specific behavioral signature, the consumer who maintains a balance consistently close to zero but never abandons the banking relationship entirely. This is the counterintuitive revelation that separates this analysis from every conventional personal finance framework. Banks do not generate maximum profit from the poorest consumers. They generate maximum profit from the almost stable consumer, the individual earning $55,000, $65,000, or $75,000 annually who is consistently close to financial stability but never crosses the threshold where extraction mechanisms fail to operate. Locked inside this clean panel is the bank segmentation logic, documented through CFPB regulatory filings and enforcement actions, showing that financial institutions deploy algorithmic behavioral scoring systems to identify customers exhibiting low-balance behavioral patterns and specifically target them for high-margin, high-interest product deployment. Your intuition that the system feels designed to drain you is not paranoia. It is perception. And it is confirmed by regulatory enforcement data, moving down to the second layer of the mechanism, the neuroscience. Clinical research from Princeton's Neuroscience Institute demonstrates that chronic financial stress elevates cortisol baseline levels, and elevated cortisol directly impairs prefrontal cortex function, the precise brain region governing impulse control, long-term planning, and rational comparative analysis. Look closely at this highlighted term, cortisol prefrontal cortex impairment loop. This is the self-reinforcing neurobiological trap. Financial stress elevates cortisol. Elevated cortisol impairs the cognitive systems responsible for escaping financial stress. Impaired cognitive systems produce financial decisions that deepen the original stress condition. The loop completes and repeats. And inside this isolated container, we examine the third extraction mechanism, the dopamine architecture of scarcity spending. Research published in Neuron Journal demonstrates that financial stress activates the same neural reward pathways as substance craving. The impulse purchase under financial stress is not a discipline failure. It is a neurobiologically predictable cortisol relief behavior, and the retail and financial marketing systems operating around you have been specifically calibrated to intercept that relief impulse at maximum extraction efficiency. From step 1, which is stress activation, moving down to step 2, which is cortisol elevation and prefrontal impairment, progressing through step 3, which is dopamine-driven relief-seeking behavior, and completing at step 4, which is high-margin product consumption or high-interest credit utilization. The progress bar completes right here at the exact point where the bank or retailer captures their margin. Tracking the timeline from start to finish, this sequence operates in minutes. The system processes it in milliseconds. Now we reach the threshold mathematics. The $20,000 coordinate is not arbitrary. It is the calculated intersection point at which 5 simultaneous extraction mechanisms fail. Compare these two financial states side by side. On the left side, the sub-$20,000 consumer whose overdraft exposure remains statistically active, whose credit negotiating position remains compromised by near-zero BATNA, whose cortisol baseline remains chronically elevated, whose bank segmentation algorithm continues flagging them for high-margin product targeting, and whose savings balance remains mathematically vulnerable to single-shock depletion. On the right side, the consumer who has crossed the 20,000 threshold. Notice the massive gap between this side and that side across all 5 dimensions simultaneously. Overdraft exposure drops to near statistical zero. Credit negotiating position expands substantially. Cortisol baseline begins normalizing as the prefrontal cortex resources previously allocated to scarcity management are systematically reallocated to long-horizon planning. The bank segmentation algorithm reclassifies the account behavioral signature. And perhaps most significantly, the liquid buffer now exceeds the mathematical threshold required to absorb a single financial shock without resetting the accumulation progress to zero. The Federal Reserve's own economic research on household liquid reserves confirms that families maintaining 3 to 6 months of liquid expenses exhibit statistically measurable reductions in financial stress markers, significantly lower utilization of high-cost credit instruments, and demonstrably improved credit decision quality. Read these exact words carefully: improved decision quality. The cognitive impairment that was consuming 13 IQ points begins reversing when the scarcity condition that produced it is eliminated. Now follow this data point into the labor economics dimension, because this is where the $20,000 threshold delivers its most underappreciated impact. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely's research on negotiation leverage demonstrates a direct mathematical relationship between a consumer's BATNA, best alternative to negotiated agreement, and their realized negotiating outcomes. Look closely at this highlighted term, BATNA. When your liquid savings read zero, your BATNA in any employment negotiation reads zero. You cannot credibly threaten to walk away from compensation terms that are below your market value when walking away produces immediate financial catastrophe. Your employer's behavioral economics team does not need to know your account balance. They need only observe your behavioral signature, your acceptance patterns, your response to lowball offers, your willingness to accept substandard terms under time pressure, to calibrate their negotiating position against your financial desperation. Labor economics research quantifies this asymmetry precisely. Employees with zero liquid savings accept 18 to 23% lower compensation packages than financially secure counterparts negotiating for identical roles. On the left side of this power scale, the financially desperate negotiator whose BATNA has collapsed to zero, giving their counterparty complete pricing power over their labor. On the right side, the financially insulated negotiator whose $20,000 buffer transforms their BATNA from zero to credible, restoring genuine optionality and measurably expanding realized compensation outcomes. The gap between these two positions on this power scale is not motivational language. It is labor economics mathematics. And the cost of remaining below this threshold extends beyond compensation. Brookings Institution research demonstrates that Americans without liquid emergency reserves are 3 times more likely to experience downward socioeconomic mobility following a single financial shock, regardless of income level. Notice this probability distribution rendering, the trajectory divergence between the consumer with liquid reserves and the consumer without, following an identical financial shock event. The insulated consumer absorbs the shock and resumes their accumulation trajectory. The uninsulated consumer resets to the baseline extraction architecture. That 3 times downward mobility multiplier is not a marginal statistical difference. It is a structural life outcome divergence produced by a single variable, liquid reserve status at the moment of shock contact. Phase 1 of the accumulation pathway begins with a single behavioral architecture decision, the automated prediscretionary transfer. Behavioral economics research on loss aversion and payment pain demonstrates that money which never enters the discretionary spending environment is neurobiologically invisible to the reward pathway systems that generate consumption impulses. The consumer who manually transfers savings after spending decisions have already activated their dopamine reward architecture faces exponentially higher friction than the consumer who automates the transfer at paycheck receipt, before the discretionary environment is ever activated. Moving down to the second layer, the behavioral anchor. Establish the transfer as a fixed, non-negotiable operational cost rather than a discretionary allocation decision. From step 1 through step 5, the progress bar completes at the 20,000 threshold, rendered as a visible accumulation stack that grows with each automated cycle. Tracking the timeline from start to finish across a 48-month accumulation window at $400 monthly, the mathematical destination is exact. $1,600 per year is insufficient. $400 monthly automated, pre-discretionary, institutionally anchored, reaches the threshold in 50 months. And this is where the mathematical physics of the situation permanently invert. The wealth velocity inversion point, the concept economists use to describe the inflection at which liquid savings surpass the critical threshold and compounding begins outpacing fee extraction rates, is not a metaphor. Notice how this productivity curve peaks at maximum extraction pressure on the left side of this inflection point, while the accumulation trajectory follows an inverse pattern on the right side, climbing nonlinearly with each compounding cycle. Follow this curve upward as it grows past the threshold coordinate. The consumer below the threshold is a financial product. The consumer above the threshold is a financial agent. That transformation is not incremental. It is a phase transition, a nonlinear shift in the mathematical dynamics of the entire system. The $20,000 threshold is not a savings goal. It is a systemic exit coordinate, the precise point at which 5 extraction mechanisms simultaneously fail to operate. 13 IQ points of cognitive bandwidth are neurobiologically restored, employer leverage over your labor dissolves to its mathematical minimum, and the compounding trajectory inverts from extraction to accumulation velocity. The peer-reviewed research documenting these mechanisms is publicly available. The regulatory data confirming the targeting architecture is institutionally published. The neuroscience explaining the cognitive impairment loop is clinically validated. What has been missing is the integrated framework that maps all 5 dimensions simultaneously against a single, precise, achievable threshold number. You now have that framework. And that framework only addresses the extraction architecture operating inside your banking relationship. There is an entirely separate institutional system operating against your long-term wealth accumulation through the investment and retirement vehicle structures most Americans are currently using without understanding the fee extraction mechanisms embedded inside them. I have mapped that complete system with identical regulatory data precision and neuroscience depth right here. Click to analyze how many of those structural extraction pathways your current portfolio is already exposed to.